Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Advances in Autism Research and Care webinar for September 2019. We're so thrilled to have you. A quick housekeeping reminder, if you have any questions to ask throughout the presentation, there's a questions bar in your doc that should be on your screen. You can type those in and I will read them out at the end of the presentation. A reminder as well that this will be recorded and uploaded to our network YouTube page. So if you'd like to share this presentation with anyone who wasn't able to attend, the link will be sent out after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Dorothea Yanuzzi, who is our network postdoc fellow, who will be welcoming our presenter for the day.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Putnam, who's the Executive Vice President of Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports and Consultation. He is the head of the May Institute research-based school-wide behavior support program, and Dr. Putnam has provided consultations to districts throughout the country. He also serves as the Senior Vice President of Research and Consultation at the National Autism Center at the May Institute, and was an expert panelist on the National Standards Project of the NAC. Dr. Putnam is currently the president of the Massachusetts Association for Behavior Analysts. In addition, he's a member of the executive board of the National Association for Positive Behavioral Support and serves as the treasurer. Dr. Putnam received his Ph.D. from Boston College and is a licensed psychologist. And without further delay, Dr. Putnam.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm glad people are interested in positive behavior support. It's the future of where schools are going and supporting students both with disabilities and without disabilities. I've provided consultation technical assistance to public schools and agencies around students with autism and disabilities for about 30 years. About 15 years ago, and particularly with those students that had the most challenging behaviors. About 15 years ago, for example, I walk into a class and I was sent to work with Jimmy Jones, and the teacher would say, well, it's great you're here for Jimmy, but I have 5 other students who really could use your support as well. And began to look at, are there more systems we could do that would improve the skills and behavior of all students rather than just going one student at a time. So I began to get interested in positive behavior interventions and supports, and as the wonderful introduction said, I've facilitated probably a couple hundred schools in many districts in terms of them implementing school-wide positive behavior support. So today's webinar, we want to talk about PBS, and our objectives are to give you some big picture ideas, as well as some examples that you can take back with you. If you look at the autism prevalence, which probably many of you know, it's increased from 1 in 50 in 2008 to 1 in 59 2018. When I started in the field, it was probably about 1 in 500. And it's significantly increased. I would consult to a very large district probably back in the 80s, and they'd have probably 20 students that they had identified with autism. Probably right now they have about 20 classrooms that serve students with autism. In the Boston Public Schools, it's reported that the autism prevalence is 1 in 37 students. And between 2016, the number of students served in special ed programs increased from 93,000 to 617,000. And this is really both a special education challenge as well as a general education challenge. This is a little bit of old data from my state, Massachusetts. And 36% of the students at that particular point in time were fully included, 16% were partially included, and probably those numbers have definitely increased to now where it's probably up to about 60% of students with ASD are included in some way, shape, or form. This is our website. This is your tax dollars at work. It's pbis.org. There's a lot of resources around students with disabilities, around school-wide PBS, classroom-wide PBS, a number of other evidence-based interventions. It's funded by the U.S. Department of Special Education Programs, and it's been in existence now for approximately 20 years. And through this particular Technical Assistance Center, there's about 28,000 schools that are using PBS at this particular point in time, over 300 high schools, approximately about 30% of schools, and we've had a really nice incremental incline in terms of the number of schools that are using PBS, impacting over 15 million students. We are very database and really look at in terms of encouraging schools to use fidelity tools. We have a number of free tools on our website that are available for schools to use. So we strongly encourage the schools and the districts that we work with to use the fidelity tools to really look at what they're measuring, what they said they would do, and seeing how effective they are in terms of their implementation. So why school-wide PBS, particularly around students with challenging behavior? Oftentimes there's a kind of a wait and see in schools to wait till things get really bad and then people intervene. One of the things we really emphasize is prevention. Is identifying students early who need to have intervention, whether it be with students with autism or with other disabilities or with just the general education population, so that in fact they get the services. And it's not necessary through special education, it just would be the general overall school services that have been ramped up to be able to address those students that may have beginning problems or maybe at risk. Secondly, what we've done is try to move schools away from the get tough, reactive practices that move towards discipline that's inclusionary, proactive, and preventative rather than reactive, punitive, and exclusionary. So our goal is really to work on in terms of having students included in inclusion classrooms as much as possible, effective classrooms. And then third, we've tried to move schools away from a train and hope training format. And a lot of schools, they get a training for 2 hours. It's very exciting. They go out very charged up, but just get back into their routines. Our goal is really to build systems such that whatever we're recommending as a school-wide intervention lasts for at least 10 years. So the goal is really to look at what systems and what procedures do we need to have to support schools relative to that. We really think that that individual school behavior support is really linked to school climates. So one of the goals is really to build positive preventative school climates that are effective, efficient, and relevant for all students. Students with autism do much better in predictable environments, much more better succeed in preventative type of environments. So one of our goals is really to build those types of environments that really support students with effective school-wide support. And what we see is the individual student behavior support is much more successful in those schools that are predictable. Everyone uses a common language. So this is school-wide positive behavior support. There isn't a book that people get. They really build their school-wide positive behavior support at Tier 1 through a framework. So it's built organically by the staff in the school, with parents, with students, to look at the issues that affect what's going on in the school. And if you look at, we use a multi-continuum tiered support model. So we look at in terms of the continuum of evidence-based interventions and the intensity of those interventions would be at those students at Tier 1, universal interventions, and those would be ramped up to be more intensive at the Tier 2 and Tier 3 level. And although we're really teaching behavior, what we see is schools who implement school-wide positive behavior support seeing better academic outcomes at Fidelity than those schools who do not. Because one of our goals is really to see more students in class and on task. And if they're in class and on task and exposed to a good academic curriculum, we would tend to see them improving on their academic performance. And this is really not just for students with autism or disabilities. This is for all students. So if we look at in terms of schools, when we look at the academic side, when a student can't read, we teach her to decode and build fluency. When the student struggles in math, we work on their math skills. When a student can't dress himself, we work on teaching him to be able to do that. However, when a student has difficulty in getting along with peers, talks back, or disrupts class, what we often see is the reactive punitive discipline. And what we advocate is students can and do better when, in fact, they're taught directly and receive positive feedback. So we really emphasize that's the way to handle problem behavior, rather than, in fact, what you see in many school districts where they have reactive, punitive, and exclusionary discipline practices. So as I mentioned, we use a multi-tiered model. We stole this from the public health system, where we're really looking at developing for all students in the building a universal school-wide positive behavior support plan, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that's for all students, whether they have severe disabilities or whether they're general education students. We work to develop a school-wide plan that works on teaching expectations and teaching how we would like students to behave in school, and then an acknowledgement system for those students who are not responding to that. We would look at specialized group-based interventions, and for those students who don't respond to that, then we would look at individual interventions. So if you look at, in general, a school system or school, we're looking at the universal plan being for all students. The specialized group-based interventions would be for some students, and those students who need individual plans, there would be about 5% of those individuals. And we have data that actually shows in schools, that's what we tend to see using office discipline referrals as our metric. So one of our goals is really not to label students as Tier 1 or Tier 2 or Tier 3, but to look at in their behavior, and all of us have strengths and weaknesses. So this might be a student with autism that they have skill deficits in comprehension or social skills, but they may be really good with technology or social studies or basketball. So one of our goals would be to look at those students who need to have the comprehension and social skills getting Tier 3 interventions, whereas the other areas where they're pretty well, they would be getting the general overall Tier 1 interventions. Or if you look at it from a social skills perspective, again, they may have strengths in technology, individual play, but have more challenges in terms of anger management or cooperative play or problem solving or peer interactions, where they may have challenges where they need to have additional social skills interventions that would be directed towards those particular skills. So we kind of joke, one of our tattoos is that multi-tiered model, the three levels in relative to the triangle. This is another one of our tattoos. So if you understand the two tattoos, you have a much better understanding in terms of school-wide positive behavior support. So one of the things when we work with schools, we're looking at what are their outcomes relative to social competence and academic achievement that fits the culture of your school. As I mentioned before, there isn't a curriculum that people are given. If they're more building this as that fits the culture and context of their school. So this would be different if, in fact, it was in the school in Boston, the Boston public schools, than it would be with a small rural school up in upstate Vermont. There would be probably two different types of school-wide interventions that would work off a framework, but they'd be different fitting the culture of their particular school. So one of the things we look at, what are the valued outcomes at the school, and usually it's in the area of academics, and usually it's in the area of social behavior, which really fits nicely with individuals with autism because they have deficits in social behavior. And then we look at in terms of, excuse me, having some data that we can look at to see whether this is effective or not. And there's two types of data. One, we look at fidelity data that I mentioned before. Is the school implementing with fidelity? And on the other hand, we look at in terms of what would be student outcomes. So usually when we look at a whole school, we're looking at referrals to the office, referrals to the nurse. It might be screenings around social skills that is done on a universal basis. It also could be suspensions. It could be absenteeism, but we're looking at in terms of what data points would be most relevant to the school that they would like to improve. And then practices is what the kids see. So they see the school-wide behavior support. They may see a social skills curriculum that's being used, but those would be the practices. And what really differentiates this from just kind of regular old school discipline practices, one would be that we're really looking at positive, preventative, inclusionary practices rather than, from a discipline perspective, reactive, punitive, and exclusionary. So there's a really focus in terms of coming up with the positive preventative practices. And those are incorporated in the school-wide positive behavior support plan. And then the other difference is the systems. Usually school folks are taught what the practices is, go out and do it, and which is oftentimes the train and hope model. Before we go and work with a school, we're looking at do they have the systems in place to really help ensure treatment fidelity with school-wide positive behavior support. So one of the things we look at is there administrative support in terms of doing this? Two, is there a representative team that would look at in terms of the stakeholders in the school? Three, does the team have time to meet to develop a school-wide positive behavior support plan? Four would be, do they have time to meet on a monthly basis to really look at the data to see whether this is effective or not, and where it's effective and where it's not effective? And then five would be, do they have a coach? So usually we're suggesting to them they have coaches that are trained in addition to the team in the implementation of school-wide positive behavior support that could continue to build capacity after we leave the school or after the trainer leaves the school. That would be to more effectively implement school-wide positive behavior support. So what would you see if you went into a school that used school-wide positive behavior support? You'd see expectations up on the wall in terms of how to behave in the school. And you might see them in the cafeteria, you might see them in the hallway, you might see them in the restroom. With students that have difficulties developmentally in terms of reading, you might see icons that would represent in terms of how students should behave. You would see some way for teachers acknowledging students engaging in those expectations. There's be some shared decision making around an open communication with both stakeholders. So it's sharing the data that we're collecting, showing in terms of how things are improving. One of the biggest things, which I think is really important for students with autism, is really the consistency in terms of student or adult interactions. Individuals with autism have a difficulty with transitions, and school-wide positive behavior support really looks at in terms of building consistencies with language used both with student to student and adult in terms of really how to behave in the school and how to interact appropriately. There's a really focus on prevention, is how can we identify students who need to have evidence-based practices around preventing more challenging behavior or improving their social skills. And as I mentioned, there's school-wide data analysis that we look at and the team looks at on a monthly basis and makes some database decisions in terms of how to move forward. So one of the things we look at is this impacts school-wide, non-classroom situations where there's less structure, classrooms, students and family. And one of the things we work with schools is try to work with them in terms of identify the smallest number of evidence-based practices that they can use to get the biggest durable effect. So let me give you an example. If the cafeteria is really problematic, particularly in terms of entering and exiting, that we may say that the fourth graders leave the cafeteria before the fifth graders come in, because that seems to be a bottleneck along those lines. And using the data to say, gee, this is what we've seen, what could we do to improve the overall functioning of the school? That may be the simplest thing we can do in terms of changing that. Or it may be that students need to be reinforced for appropriate behavior in the cafeteria, and there's very little reinforcement for all the students really don't know how to behave in the cafeteria. So one of our goals is really to teach them how to behave in the cafeteria, which again, around the social skills perspective, students with autism really need more training in the social skills. And it may be looking at, as one of the expectations, is sit with a friend, because we've noticed that a number of the students basically don't have relationships in the cafeterias, so we want to encourage students for sitting with a friend. So on a school-wide basis, as we've talked about, there's the leadership team with coaching. There's a common purpose and approach to discipline, which is positive, preventative, inclusionary. That we'd want to have 3 to 5 positively stated expectations for the whole school. It might be safe, be respectful, be responsible. We would want to look at in terms of breaking those down in terms of specific areas across the school. And then most importantly, there would be procedures for teaching that expected behavior. So the emphasis on teaching, which again for students with autism who have challenges in the social area, that really is important, that they along with the rest of the students are being taught the expected behavior. And then some procedures for encouraging expected behavior, and then a continuum of procedures for discouraging inappropriate behavior. And then as we've talked about, our database monitoring system. And in the classrooms, we're looking at class-wide positive expectations. There oftentimes are routines, and the challenge that teachers have sometimes is the children actually following the routines, because they may not be explicitly taught. So one of the things we're suggesting that as those routines be explicitly taught for all students that are in the classroom, and the students with who have some challenges with that may need to be taught numerous times. Some students may need to have some type of reminder on their desk in terms of what the routines are. And then we would look at a ratio of 6 to 8 positive to negative adult to student interaction. So one of the goals is really to increase the number of positive, because that's what we see in most schools, increase the number of positive to negative interactions to reinforce the appropriate behavior. We also look at having active supervision, which means moving about the room, That's another evidence-based practice that you see in classroom behavior management. And then redirections from minor and frequent behavior errors, frequent pre-corrections for chronic errors. So if walking in the hallway is a challenge, then before the students leave to go out in the hallway, is remember this is the way you need to walk on the right-hand side. You need to have a inside voice. Whatever other types of challenges might be, there would be pre-corrections around those areas that are going to be most challenging for the students. And then in the non-classrooms, which might be the hallway, the buses, the cafeteria, a number of different non-classroom settings, we would again be teaching those expectations, have active supervision by all, have the pre-corrections I just talked about, and then the acknowledgement of appropriate behavior. And then on the individual student level, we're looking at having behavioral competence at the school or district level, so that may be a BCBA or a school psychologist or a school social worker that's trained in terms of applied behavior analysis. Those individual plans, we're looking at developing function-based behavior support planning so that people understand what the function of the behavior is, so that we can teach better communication skills so that students get their needs better met through appropriate behavior rather than inappropriate behavior. We've talked about team and database decision-making, targeted social skills and self-management, and most students with autism need to have targeted social skills to improve their overall social skills. So here's some examples of, so one of the way we approach this is either students have skill deficits or they have performance deficits. So, for example, if a student wants to take a ball, get a ball from another student, and he goes up and just takes the ball, is it because he doesn't know what to do or when to do it? Or is it because he's not motivated? He knows what to do, but he's not motivated to do that. So when we look at social skills deficits, we're looking at either skill deficits or performance deficits, and trying to address those and from a school-wide basis is both addressing the skill deficits as well as the performance deficits. So here's an example of Miss Muter who would like to go over a few of her rules on the first day of school, and you can see it's all the no's, which oftentimes is what we see from the school discipline handbook. It's all what not to do, not what to do. So, for example, here's in a school: no food, no weapons, no backpacks, no drugs, no smoking, no bullying. This is not the way we're looking at it. We'd rather have school rules and be safe, be responsible, and be respectful. So it's really working with the schools to develop their own rules. Some of them already have expectations that they have already, and some of them takes a little while, particularly with high schools, to really come up with what their school-wide expectations might be. And here's another one from the Lancer School, where they have the PRIDE acronym. Many of the schools develop little acronyms that help the students remember what their expectations are. Here's some examples from high schools and middle schools. And oftentimes, the schools that are multilingual, we suggest that they translate them into the language that the students use or may use. We've had schools that brought in the local cable company to videotape what their school rules were and how their school-wide positive behavior system worked in Hispanic, strong Hispanic area, and they translated, or actually had the kids singing songs and going over the expectations in Spanish, so that the families and the community would be able to understand that. So one of the goals is really to make this culturally and contextually appropriate. And what's important, I think, for students with autism is the consistency using a common language, because it just makes it much clearer in terms of what the social expectations are in a variety of these situations. So once we get respect ourselves, respect others, respect property, then we're looking at what does this look like in the setting. So what does it look like on the hallways? What does it look like in the playgrounds? What does it look like in the cafeteria? So in some cases, maybe sit with a friend, look for somebody who's by themselves and pair up. So that might be one of the expectations if we want to try to build friendships. So it's set up, and this is what the teachers would teach these expectations in the different areas that they're involved in. So we have the social skill and then the natural context, which also I think is important for students with autism because they don't generalize very well. So to the extent that we're actually teaching it in natural context, then that works very well. And then we have these very clear behavioral examples. So here's some examples of school staff teaching the expectations in the cafeteria or just outside the school, or how to enter the school in lines, or on the other one in the bottom right hand is how you use the restrooms, which is an important skill. What we find oftentimes at the elementary level as well as the high school, everyone likes a clean bathroom. And then we're really coming up with a way to acknowledge those expected behaviors. So here's some examples of some type of acknowledgments. Now, clearly these would be developmentally appropriate. So if you look at students that are at the preschool level, it's much different than students at the high school level. But some way to acknowledge appropriate behavior. That golden hand was a custodian who said, I want to be part of this as well. So he took a rubber glove, filled it up with plaster of Paris, painted it gold, and put it in the cleanest room in the school to reinforce those students and teachers for having clean classrooms. And really what we're looking for is these tangible things are really prompts for engaging in authentic teacher interaction. So one of the goals is really to use this as kind of a way to remind teachers to make sure they're catching the kids being good. So here's one with Husky Buck that the students used, and you can see on the wall it's being responsible is, being respectful is, being a learner is, and the students would choose what kind of acknowledgement system that they would like. Or in a middle school, this would be 6th grade, 7th grade, and when they filled the bucket, they would earn some type of reinforcers for having appropriate behavior. We also try to involve the staff as much as possible, so we really work on coming up with an acknowledgement system for the staff. So in this case, it's the students were able to dress up their teacher if they earned so many tickets. Just an example of the group that got dressed up. Or on the other hand, there's another custodian, instead of a golden hand, had a golden plunger. Or the principal would give out one free period. So remember, the goal is having fidelity with educational staff actually following through with the expectations, development, with teaching the expectations, coming up with a way to reinforce students for appropriate behavior. So we really focus on reinforcing the staff for following through with the program. And then one of the things we look at is trying to look at for teachers, what's a major problem behavior, what's a minor, what should be managed in the classroom, what should be office managed, as a way to improve classroom management, because one of our goals is, again, to have more kids in class and on task. to have better managed classrooms. So the staff or the team will look at what's consisting of office discipline referrals and determine whether there should be classroom managed or office managed. And it's up to the teacher to kind of make that decision, but at least we've given them some guidelines relative to that. So what's the process to develop this? So this, again, is different than most other initiatives that schools use. That one, there's a representative team, which would consist of the administrator, grade levels, teachers, special ed teachers, counselors, school psychologists, specials, teacher assistants. So there may be 8 to 10 folks that in a high school, it's greater, that are involved in this in terms of developing this school-wide positive behavior support plan. And what we're looking for is the staff will vote in a lot of cases in terms of whether they want to do this, because we're looking for 80% buy-in. So if there's not sufficient buy-in from the staff or for the administrator, we suggest wait until you have some buy-in, because this is systems change. This is just not taking a book and reading it. We're talking about real systems change. And then we have the agreements that the principal agrees that this is important. The staff agrees this is important. They agree that they're going to go to at least a 3-day training to build their school-wide positive behavior support plan. They agree that they're going to collect some data. They agree that the team is going to meet monthly and look at the data and make some database decisions. So out of those agreements comes the database action plan that's implemented in the school, and then it's evaluated whether it's effective or not. It's broken down in terms of, well, is it effective in what areas, which students, and for which type of behaviors, and how can we switch and change the emphasis. If in fact disrespect is a problem in the school, is how do we look at in terms of changing the expectations to address that particular behavior. So I think we talked about this. There's active administrative participation. There's designated coaches that get extra training, because the goal would be the folks that are really helping the team and the school build their behavior support plan, as well as looking at sustaining that. We need the representative team time to meet on a monthly basis, time to develop the school-wide positive behavior support plan, and then ongoing monthly review of discipline data and measures of treatment fidelity. So as we said, we're moving away from a train and hope to a much more clearer train and support. So what would we expect for outcomes from implementing school-wide positive behavior support plan? So implementing Tier 1, we see from the research increases in prosocial behavior across all the students, increases in organizational health climate, the behavioral climate of the school. We see that improving. Even though we are not teaching academics, we oftentimes see improvements in statewide test scores, decreases in office discipline referrals, decreases in suspensions, decreases in reported bullying, and that's important because these students are much higher risk of being bullied than neurotypical students. And if, in fact, they implement with fidelity, we oftentimes see further decreases in office discipline referrals, decreases in suspensions, and increases in statewide test scores in math over time. So what do we have as evidence? Well, what are the evidence-based practices for students? Because one of our goals is really to introduce evidence-based practice for students with ASD. So as we look at Tier 2 and we look at Tier 3, one of the things is to make sure that the school is using evidence-based practices for those students with the ASD. Many of you may be familiar with the National Standards Project that was done at the National Autism Center at at the May Institute, and along with the National Professional Development Center out of the University of North Carolina. Both of these looked at what's out there in terms of interventions for students with autism and came up with what was determined to be evidence-based interventions. One of the things we promote as part of school-wide positive behavior support is the use of evidence-based interventions. So these were the evidence-based interventions that were found, 11 comprehensive interventions in 2019 and moved up to 17 in 2015. And then in 2008, the National Professional Development Center ended up with 24 focused interventions. So, for example, visual supports. Well, one of the things we would look at with children with autism is looking at adopting the school-wide programs, so there's a lot more visual supports for individuals with autism. We would promote discrete trial training particularly around Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. Video modeling is great in terms of that particular population as well. So we would strongly support and advocate for students with autism being given or these interventions being used with them to really teach them the expectations relative to school-wide positive behavior support. So what are the benefits for students with ASD? It creates a much more proactive, preventative, and positive school climate. It improves the effectiveness of behavior support practice and social skills interventions because there'd be regular ongoing assessments around social skills, which would lead to interventions. It assists with the implementation of evidence-based practices. Provides consistent language and practices, which improves the overall behavioral climate of the school and improves the functioning of the school, particularly for those individuals with ASD, because it's much clearer in terms of what the social expectations are. Supports inclusionary school settings and reduces bullying. So those are some of the benefits we see for students with ASD. So I'll stop here and take questions. We got a couple minutes.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob. I just wanted to start by saying thank you very much for your time and for your great presentation. The first question that we have is, what is the most common mistake that is made in applying a PBS intervention?
I think the most common mistake is people think they're doing it because they don't measure fidelity. So I do a lot of training and with school psychologists and social workers and BCBAs, and I'll ask the audience how many of you are actually implementing school-wide positive behavior support, and I get many of the hands go up. Then I say, how many of you are measuring fidelity of implementation, and I get very few of the hands go up. So probably the biggest mistake is not really implementing with full fidelity because you don't get the maximum benefits without implementing with fidelity. I think the other mistake, and I really don't think it's a mistake, but oftentimes schools are not as preventative and proactive as we want. And if they don't implement with fidelity, basically they're not going to get the benefits of that proactive, preventative types of supports that we would like to have them engage in.
Thank you. Next question is PBS a type of applied behavior analysis?
It definitely is. It's based on applied behavioral analysis. It's applied behavior analysis to scale. There's a great article by Horner and Sagai in behavioral analysis and practice that talks about bringing applied behavioral analysis to scale. So it fits in beautifully with the National Standards Project and the National Professional Development Center that really found applied behavioral analysis was the treatment of choice for individuals with autism. We're just looking at bringing this to scale so that, in fact, everyone's taught of expectations, that there's a reinforcement system to catch students actually being or appropriate, following the expectations. So it's clearly applied behavioral analysis at its best at a systems level.
Thank you. Next question is, how do you decide if PBS is a good strategy for managing a particular challenging behavior?
Well, I think it's probably the most effective, along with from applied behavioral analysis, the most effective way of looking at a challenging behavior. The simple thing would be, could we just use tier 1 interventions to change that behavior, or do we need to move to tier 3, which would require a functional behavioral assessment? It may even require a functional analysis, which is the kind of the state of the art in terms of looking at assessment of challenging behavior. So from my perspective, I think that tends to be the direction that the research shows works the best in terms of challenging behavior.
Thank you. And the last question we have was, what does the process look like for school administrators who are looking to train school staff and monitor their engagement in using PBS?
Well, one is they need to buy in. So they need to, so if we look from an administrative perspective, what the expectations would be, the expectations would be that the administrators at all trainings would be at all monthly meetings, and it might not be the principal, it could be the assistant principal, but somebody in administration, that the administrator would promote throughout the year by giving time to the team to have ways to remind the students, maybe parties, in terms of reminding the students and the staff of the expectations and what the acknowledgement system would be. And then I think the second part, in terms of the administrator, would be to look at, once they have tier 1 in place and they have it with fidelity, is to really look at the school moving to tier 2, and then organizing their tier 3 interventions, because schools oftentimes have tier 3 interventions where they have behavior support plans developed from a functional behavioral assessment, but they're not really organized, and they don't look at it from a systems perspective as how well the students are doing. And so from an administrative perspective, it would be important that they look at moving on to tier 2 and tier 3 and really develop the full continuum of interventions.
Thank you. And I actually have one actual last question. How can parents get involved so that they're reinforcing PBS messaging at home?
So what we suggest, a couple things. That's a great question. One is, we strongly suggest that parents be on the team. 2, we strongly suggest that schools, that they have a kind of a PBS night, or if they have their opening night where they bring in all the parents, that they review what PBS is, review what the expectations would be. In some cases, we've had the kids go home and teach the parents what the expectations. These are the expectations. The homework is to teach your parents about the expectations. Some schools have brought the parents in, and here we'll develop a home matrix like we had in school. What are your expectations, which could be similar to the school. What does that look like in the home bathroom? What does it look like in terms of when we're eating dinner? What does it look like when you're doing your homework? And then building some type of acknowledgement or reinforcement plan for the student engaging in those particular behaviors. So parents are really, really important. We find that this is a way to support parents, because a lot of times the only time the parents get a message from the school is when their kids have done something wrong, and one of the goals is really to work on having a much more positive relationship with the families by acknowledging the kids' behavior and sending that information home. So a lot of times it's like, oh, like, wow, my kid just got this information. get this note from school, and it's a positive note saying how wonderful your child was in school doing his work. So it's really working on that. I give a example of at the end of the school year, they had a student called his mom, said, "You got to come pick me up," and his mom said, "Well, what you do now?" And in fact, they had the raffle with the coffee and good slips, and the kid had won that, and it was a bike, and he couldn't take the bike on the bus. So it was just a whole different relationship in terms of the family. In some cases, schools will give out note cards already self-addressed and say to the teachers, you need to send a positive note home once every other month to every parent that recognizes the student for doing something positive. So the goal is really to, in some cases, switch the relationship. And what we see in a lot of PBS schools is they get a lot more parental involvement because it's a much more positive place to be.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I just wanted to say another big thank you to Bob Putnam for presenting this webinar today and for taking our questions. A quick reminder that this presentation will be available on YouTube. It will be uploaded and it will also be sent out as a link. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.